Donald Trump leads Joe Biden by about 3 points, according to the latest Real Clear polling average. Comparatively, Trump leads by just a point per Decision Desk HQ in The Hill, based on almost 800 polls released this cycle. And then, according to 538, Trump leads by about 2 points. So across these three trackers, Trump leads by around 1 to 3 points nationally. I think it's also worth noting, amidst the current news cycle, that Trump leads Vice President Kamala Harris by a point as well. That all being said, here in the US, of course, we do not elect our presidents by the national popular vote. Rather, what matters most is how the two major party candidates are performing in the key battleground states. In order to be elected president, a candidate must secure at least 270 electoral college votes out of the 538 up for grabs across the entire country. The 2024 map is as narrow as it ever has been, with no more than 10 states considered to be in play, truly, for either Biden or Trump. In today's video, I'm going to take you through the state of play in the most competitive states that will determine the winner of this election, offering my own personal prediction ratings ranging from safe to lean to toss-up, and that takes into account all of the data available to us from past results, current polling, betting odds, shifts, trends, demographic data, and a whole lot more that you see on this sheet here. Now let's start by filling in all of the safe states for Donald Trump. Starting up in the Mountain West region, we have Alaska, Utah, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, Nebraska at large, as well as the 1st and 3rd congressional districts. Remember, Nebraska and Maine split their electoral votes, awarding 2 to the statewide winner and then 1 per congressional district. We'll get to Maine later on. Kansas, Oklahoma, Iowa, Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and then finally Louisiana. And then for Joe Biden, Washington, Oregon, California, and Hawaii down the Pacific coast, Colorado, Illinois, New York, Maine's 1st congressional district, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and then D.C., Washington, D.C. Now, each of these solid states have a better than 95% chance of voting for either Biden or Trump, and therefore are not really worth diving deeper into here. Notably, Iowa and Ohio have become reliably Republican in recent years after voting for Obama in 2008 and 2012. Trump has carried them both by more than 8 points in both of his elections, 2016 and 2020, and has thus far polled in front of Biden by a comfortable margin so far this cycle. For Biden, on the other hand, there have been some polls that have come out showing Trump within striking distance in New Jersey and New York, but that's not at all unusual at this stage in the cycle. At least in every cycle that I can remember, there have been polls showing solid states, such as these, as more competitive than they really end up being once all the votes are in. New York and New Jersey have backed Democrats by double-digit margins in 8 straight cycles. They voted for Biden by 23 and 16 points, respectively, in 2020. I could certainly see those margins drop down to like 15 and 10 points, but Trump won't actually get all that close to flipping them, even as he is on pace to perform much better across the board. Now looking at the Electoral College vote count up here, Biden holds an initial advantage with 191 electoral votes over Trump's 148. This is primarily due to the fact that the Democrats' safe states here down the Pacific coast and then all the way up here in the Northeast do tend to be more highly populated than the more sparsely populated safe Republican states spread out across the middle of the country. California, Illinois, New York, and New Jersey, as well as Massachusetts, combine for 126 electoral votes alone, almost at Trump's current total. That said, once we add the likely states to both candidates, you're going to see that preliminary lead for Biden start to disappear. Likely states are those with a strong amount of lean toward a party, but where an upset may be possible if one candidate wins in a landslide. So in other words, while safe or solid states have a better than 95% chance of backing either Biden or Trump and are therefore effectively landslide proof, these likely states have around an 80 to 95% chance of backing one candidate, and therefore could flip in a landslide. Now, before we get started with the more competitive states, please make sure to subscribe to my channel down below for more election analysis like this. I have noticed that around 88% of my viewers right now are not subscribed to the channel, so please, if you can just take a second and click that red button down below. It's free and it does help me continue to make content like this. Thank you. Starting with Trump, I am first going to place Maine's 2nd congressional district in the likely Republican category. Now, while Maine's statewide contest is influenced most heavily by its more urban and therefore Democratic-friendly 1st district that backed Biden by 23 points in 2020, this more northern 2nd district is actually the most rural congressional district in the entire country, and thereby much more friendly to Republican candidates. It did back Trump by 10 points in 2016 and then 7 in 2020. And the two polls surveyed here so far this cycle have the former president up by around 14 and 20 points. If I had to project the 2024 margin, I would say that a Trump win of around 9 to 12 points within the district is probably the most likely outcome at this point. And then down to the southeast in Florida, all of the momentum is with the GOP in the Sunshine State. Trump carried this renowned swing state by a 3.4-point margin in 2020. That was the largest margin of victory for any presidential candidate in Florida since 2004. It was also just one of 5 states where Trump actually performed better than he did in 2016. And then even more recently, in the 2022 midterm elections, Republican incumbents Governor Ron DeSantis and Senator Marco Rubio both won re-election by landslide margins, at least by Florida standards, 19% and 16%. So while Florida had previously commanded more Democratic attention than any other state really on the electoral map, at least over the last 2+ decades, that simply has not and will not be the case here in 2024. Trump currently leads Biden by 6.3% in DDHQ's polling average based on 19 polls. He's even led by double digits in several surveys over the last couple months. My conservative estimate would pin Trump's 2024 margin at around 6 to 7 points, though I think the range of outcomes here is actually pretty wide, and I would not be at all surprised if he ends up winning by closer to 10 or 11 points when all is said and done. Over in Texas, it will also go down as likely Republican. The Lone Star State has not voted for a Democratic presidential candidate in almost 50 years, though it has become much more competitive over the last decade. Democrats entered 2020 with high hopes of flipping Texas blue and thereby turning the Electoral College math entirely in their favor, though Trump's 6-point win in 2020 effectively put those hopes at a standstill. His margin of lead did drop from 9 points against Hillary Clinton in 2016. It was the lowest of the 21st century, and Biden's 46.5% vote share was the highest for a Democrat in Texas since 1976. But Biden was polling within 1.5 points of Trump in the final polling averages, and several forecasters had Texas rated as a toss-up going into Election Day. Ultimately, Trump and the Republican Party made rapid gains among Hispanics in 2020, and that has continued since, specifically here in the Rio Grande Valley region in South Texas, even as you see the large urban and suburban areas moving in large numbers towards Biden. A lot of these Hispanic voters quite simply abandon the Democratic coalition. The party had been benefiting from the state's rising population of college graduates, younger voters, and minorities, but Texas is 40% Hispanic, rendering Democratic losses among that demographic especially catastrophic. Trump should carry Texas by a margin of around 6 to 10 points again this November. So that completes the likely Republican states for Trump, and as I had hinted at earlier, they have completely evaporated Biden's initial electoral vote advantage. Granted, Texas and Florida are the 2nd and 3rd largest states in the entire country, and they raised Trump's total all the way up to 219 electoral votes now, only 51 votes shy of that magic number, 270. Trump's got around a 90% chance, I would say, of winning at least this many electoral votes come election night. I guess you could call it his floor. As for Democrats, we'll add just one likely state to President Joe Biden's tally as well, down here in New Mexico. It did back Biden by 10 points, compared to 13.5 points up in Colorado. 2020 actually marked the first time since 1968 that New Mexico voted to the right of its neighbor, Colorado, which is now considered solidly Democratic. They did both narrowly vote for George Bush as recently as 2004 and have since backed Democratic candidates by margins of around 5 to 12 points in every election since. The fact that New Mexico is now generally considered to be less Democratic than Colorado, though, can largely be attributed to its demographic profile. It is the 12th least educated state in the country in terms of the proportion of residents with a college degree at 30%, which is the lowest of any Biden-won state besides battleground Nevada. And it's also the 15th most rural, which ranks only behind Vermont and Maine up in the Northeast, among the least urban Democratic states. It's also the only majority Hispanic state in the U.S., and so if Republicans continue to gain ground with Hispanic voters, as we discussed over here in Texas, that could potentially make up some of their deficits, at least enough for me to project that it will remain in likely D territory around a D+7 to D+9 margin. That raises Joe Biden's electoral vote tally up to 196. It's an extremely narrow margin separating the two candidates here, with 123 electoral votes remaining in the 10 states that we have yet to assign a rating to. These are the states I expect to be most actively campaigned in this cycle, and ultimately end up being the 10 closest states when all of the votes are counted. Let's go ahead and label our lean states now. Remember that safe states have a better than 95% chance of going one way, likely states between 80 to 95%, and now these lean states all come in around 65 to 80%. For Joe Biden, most of his lean states have already shifted from likely to lean as a consequence of the environment generally trending in favor of Trump. They are still more likely to vote blue than red, but should his numbers deteriorate even further, there is a chance Trump could flip 1 or 2 once all is said and done. And these are Minnesota, Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, Maine's statewide contest, New Hampshire, and Virginia. Lots to go over here. Let's start in Virginia. Realistically, the Biden campaign will not have to spend that much time in the Commonwealth for him to still win it by at least 4 to 5 points. It's just a fundamentally blue state now. There's been a lot of discourse, though, surrounding Virginia lately, as 3 of the last 4 polls surveyed here showed Biden and Trump tied. Because of these polls, I have downgraded it from likely to lean, though it would take a series of polls showing Trump leading for me to actually move it any further toward the former presidents. Ultimately, the diversification of Northern Virginia over the last 2 decades or so, as well as sliding suburban support for Trump in 2020 specifically, allowed Biden to win this once key battleground state by 10 points in 2020. And Republicans just simply have not looked all that competitive here in statewide elections outside of Glenn Youngkin's off-year governor upset, and he only won by about 2 points in as favorable an environment for Republicans as there possibly could be. As for the state of Minnesota, and New Hampshire for that matter, these 2 states have followed a very similar trend over the last decade. They both backed Obama by more than 5 points in 2012, and then narrowed significantly in 2016, as Clinton just barely held both states by 1.5% in Minnesota and 0.3% in New Hampshire. They then shifted back strongly in favor of Biden in 2020 by 7-point margins each. Minnesota surprisingly holds the longest active streak of voting for Democratic presidential candidates at 12 straight elections. And I say surprisingly because it is often decided by very narrow margins, while New Hampshire, meanwhile, last voted Republican in the 2000 election. It has likewise been pretty competitive, though reliably Democratic. It's at least the most competitive state in the Northeast over the last few election cycles. Maine has voted blue in 8 straight elections, most recently by 9 points in 2020 for Biden. Statewide results here do tend to lean left due to the ideological alignment of its more urban and very well-educated 1st district that mirrors the rest of the solidly blue New England states, though the statewide contests do tend to be more competitive. As I had mentioned earlier, the 2nd district is much more rural and less educated. Maine's statewide population is actually the least racially diverse and the oldest in terms of senior population as well in the entire country, which also helps Republicans, of course, be more competitive, as both of those demographics do tend to lean more conservative. It's also going to be especially worth monitoring RFK's status on the ballot this cycle in Maine, as it does use ranked choice voting. So if neither Biden or Trump hit 50%, then the race could come down to how third-party voters rank them behind their preferred first pick. Finally, in Nebraska's 2nd District, Biden will have another great opportunity to extract an electoral vote away from Trump in a deep red state, as Nebraska's state legislature failed to get rid of its split electoral vote system. This Omaha-based 2nd District is rapidly left-trending, going from Romney +8 in 2012 to Trump +2 in 2016, and then Biden +7 in 2020. The district's lines were redrawn after the 2020 census to be slightly more favorable to Republicans, though Biden would still have won the current configuration by 6.3% in 2020. As for Trump now, we can place both North Carolina and Georgia in the lean Republican column. Now, for how competitive North Carolina has consistently been here in 21st century politics, Barack Obama remains the only Democrat to win the Tar Heel state since 1976, and even he failed to hold it during his re-election bid in 2012. The GOP has now won the last 8 federal elections for president and U.S. Senate in North Carolina, each by less than 6 percentage points, defining the state as a purple-ish, yet reliably lean Republican state. Most recently, Trump carried North Carolina by just a point in 2020, after carrying it in 2016 by just under 4 points. Now here in 2024, Trump is leading Biden by an average of 4.3% based on 41 polls added to the DDHQ and the Hill polling average. He has led in every single poll taken here in North Carolina, going all the way back to March, which is of course a notable change from the last 2 cycles where both Biden and Clinton led in most surveys headed into the election before their ultimate losses. In the end, I think we're likely to see Trump carry North Carolina this November by a margin similar to his 2016 win, around 4 points, perhaps closer to 5 or 6 if things keep moving his way. Now, the 5 states remaining have a very high chance of ending this cycle as the closest states in terms of margin. Joe Biden carried all 5 of these states, plus Georgia, by less than 3 percentage points in the 2020 election after Trump had carried them all except for Nevada in 2016. Mathematically speaking, if Trump manages to flip back into his column any 4 of these 6 key battlegrounds, including Georgia, he would be elected president with at least 270 electoral votes. Both candidates' most efficient path, though, runs through the Rust Belt. If Biden manages to hold on to Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, he'll hit exactly 270 electoral votes. Conversely, if Trump flips these 3 back into his column, as he did in 2016, he would hit 279. Though Trump's most efficient path would be to just win Pennsylvania, along with Georgia, in which case he would hit exactly 270 electoral votes. Remember as well that in the 2020 election, the combined margin of victory for Biden across Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona was less than 43,000 votes out of more than 11 million cast. Had Trump managed to persuade those 43,000 or so voters to back him instead of Biden, he would be serving a 2nd term right now. I think people sometimes forget just how close that election was. Even if Biden was a reasonably popular incumbent entering this re-election year, he would still be operating with little room for error. It's just the nature of our politics today. Every election will be close, as polarization has made it unthinkable for Democrats to even consider voting for Trump, and likewise Republicans for Biden. Therefore, each side is practically guaranteed to win at least 40% of the votes, and so it's that 20% or so in the middle that will swing the election. Now let's get into my personal predictions for the most likely outcome across these 4 remaining states. Remember that while I am keeping current polling data in mind, these predictions are not dated to if this election were held today. They are based on how I believe the election held on November 5th, 2024, will ultimately turn out. Starting with the absolutely critical Rust Belt trio of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. As you can see here in the updated Electoral College counts in the race to 270, one of the major storylines concerning electoral math this cycle is the fact that even if Trump manages to win both Nevada and Arizona, and thereby sweeps the Sun Belt battlegrounds, if Biden can just simply hold on to Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the 3 battlegrounds that he has consistently pulled the least bad in so far this cycle, he would still win re-election with exactly 270 electoral votes. And incredibly, this mirrors the dynamic of the last two elections as well, as had Hillary Clinton held the then-called blue wall states in the Democratic column in 2016, she would have defeated Trump, and likewise, had Trump held them in his corner in 2020, he would have won a second term, and we'd be in a much different situation right now. I do generally tend to analyze Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania as a trio because their voting history and demographic profiles are just so similar. Historically speaking, this trio is often considered ancestrally Democratic due to the strong presence of white working-class voters that had previously made up the backbone of the Democratic electorate for most of the late 20th century. They had each voted blue in the 6 presidential cycles between 1988 and 2016, which is when Trump narrowly flipped them into his column in an upset thanks to his emergent appeal among non-college white voters in the region. It was this same appeal that made the other Midwest swing states like Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, and Missouri go from Obama-era purple states to now solidly Republican. Joe Biden did, of course, flip the core Rust Belt trio in 2020 back into the Democratic column, as suburban voters, especially suburban women, turned against Trump in large numbers. Demographically speaking, they each rank very closely in terms of racial diversity and educational attainment. Wisconsin is the 12th whitest state and ranks 29th in proportion of residents with a college degree, whereas Michigan ranks 20th and 33rd in those categories, while Pennsylvania ranks 19th and 24th, so all around 10th to 30th in both categories. Now, in 2024, it's truly anyone's guess as to how they'll vote next. On the one hand, widespread backlash against the Supreme Court's decision to strike down Roe v. Wade rallied Democrats up and down the ballot in key races here in 2022 and 23. Democrats swept the races for governor in all 3 states, significantly outperforming polling expectations in each case. And in both Wisconsin and Pennsylvania Senate races as well, we saw John Fetterman and Mandela Barnes beat their final polling averages by 5 and 3 points respectively, though of course Barnes still came up short against Republican incumbent Ron Johnson. Perhaps even more notable than those results, though, a highly politicized Wisconsin Supreme Court election that almost entirely revolved around abortion rights in 2023 went the liberal justice's way by 11 points. Generally speaking, Rust Belt states are less religious and therefore less socially conservative than the Sun Belt states. A Pew Research Center survey found that in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, adults favoring the legality of abortion in all or most cases exceed those opposing it by margins of 12, 7, and 8 percentage points respectively, whereas this support is narrower in Arizona and North Carolina at 3 and 4 points, and then it reverses in Georgia, where opponents outnumber supporters by a point. All of that being said, despite some economic indicators rebounding over the last couple months or so, a majority of voters in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, again, still hold very negative views on the state of the economy, according to polling data. And history tells us that the incumbent president's re-election odds are heavily tied to how voters feel about their personal financial situations at the time of the election. The economy quite simply always tops voters' key issues, especially in this region of the country. So in order for Biden to hold on to these states, he will need voters' economics outlooks to improve quickly. Like I said, though, the polling in these 3 states has been less disastrous for the Democratic president than in the Sun Belt region. In Michigan, Biden actually leads Trump here by less than half a point, 0.4%, based on 56 polls. This has flipped back and forth a bit over the last few weeks, and when looking at the full field average, including independent Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Trump leads here by 0.9%, based on 40 polls. Now, this is probably more notable as RFK has officially qualified for the ballot in Michigan, as confirmed by the Secretary of State's office. Both averages, though, do show Biden and Trump are essentially statistically tied, as really anything below 2 to 3 points is within the margin of error. Now, prior to the first debate blow-up, betting markets were giving Biden an edge here, or at least better odds than in any of the other key swing states, due to both recent voting trends and demographics. But simply, there is no way that anybody can say Michigan is anything but a pure toss-up right now. Let's take a look at the average in Wisconsin now. Trump leads Biden by a point, according to 43 polls in DDHQ's latest average. You can see here the timeline shows polls in Wisconsin have been incredibly close all cycle long. Though whenever I look at polls in Wisconsin, I always feel like I need to note that the polls here in 2016 and 2020 underestimated Trump by a greater margin than any other state here over the last two cycles. He trailed Hillary Clinton by 6 points in the final 538 average in 2016, yet won by 0.8%, and then Biden led by 8 points in 2020, yet only won by 0.6%. As for the state of Pennsylvania now, Trump leads by his widest margin of the three, 4%, based on 58 polls, 48.7% to 44.7%. This is Trump's largest lead since February here, as the three polls to come out following the debate showed him up by 7, 5, and 4 points, respectively. Ultimately, both Pennsylvania and Wisconsin are fundamentally more Republican than Michigan, and the polls now seem to be backing that up. I do have both states tilting towards Trump here in my latest ratings, shifting to the right from the toss-up category. Now let's head out to the Southwest here. In Nevada, there are numerous positive indicators for the GOP here, even as Democrats have dominated statewide elections since Barack Obama's 13-point victory in 2008. Nevada has now shifted 5 points in favor of Republicans relative to the nation since 2012 and ranks 44th out of the 50 U.S. states in terms of the proportion of residents with a college degree. That's the lowest of any state that Biden won in 2020. His 2.4-point win 4 years ago was identical to Clinton's 2.4-point win in 2016, and so that means that Nevada actually trended to the right compared to the rest of the nation, considering, of course, that Biden won the national popular vote by a greater margin than Clinton did. Republicans also won a closely contested race for governor in 2022, flipping it from blue to red, and came within a point of defeating a relatively popular Democratic incumbent senator in that election as well. As for current polling, perhaps no other state has trended more positively for Trump than Nevada has, where he currently leads by 4.5 points based on 40 polls in the DDHQ and the Hill average. He is led by around 4 to 6 points all cycle long, and again, if we expand this race out to RFK Jr. and others in a state that RFK has indeed qualified for the ballot, Trump's lead grows to 5.7% based on 29 polls. Now, of course, it's hard to be entirely convinced that Trump will actually end up winning by such a large margin in November. Even just a Trump plus 3-point victory would be an impressive 5-point swing from Biden plus 2 in 2020. And while I do think that a Trump victory is slightly more likely than not, say 55 to 60%, that's no better than a toss-up. I'm placing Nevada in the toss-up column for now, though if we get to September and Trump keeps polling like he has, I'll definitely reconsider. Finally, we have Arizona, where Biden won by only 0.3% in 2020. It was his second narrowest victory after Georgia at 0.2%. Democrats have now won 4 straight federal contests for president and Senate in Arizona, and the most recent race for governor as well. It had long been a reliably Republican state, as beginning with Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952 and ending with Trump in 2016, Republican presidential candidates had carried Arizona in 16 of 17 presidential races. But now over the last decade or so, Arizona has rapidly trended towards the political center in American politics, and this has primarily been driven by the explosive population growth and diversification of Phoenix, the fastest growing metro area in the entire country. Much like Clark County, encompassing the Las Vegas metropolitan region in Nevada, Maricopa County, encompassing Phoenix in Arizona, is the single biggest factor in determining statewide elections here, as it contains about 2/3 of Arizona's population. Joe Biden became the first Democrat to receive the most votes in Maricopa since 1952, as the area has seen a rapid influx of college-educated voters from around the country, combined with rising turnout among Latinos and Native Americans, those all being left-leaning demographics. The split in Maricopa in 2020, 50.3% to 48.1%, and Biden's raw vote lead of 45,000 votes was just enough to overcome the slight Republican edge across the rest of the state to help Biden win by 11,000 votes, 49.4% to 49.1%. Looking ahead to 2024 now, though, the polling trends in Arizona and Nevada have mirrored each other very closely. Trump leads by 4.2% right now, based on 53 polls. The former president has also led here by around this margin all cycle long. I would personally place his odds at this point as being more favorable than they are in Nevada, somewhere between 60 to 70%. In my mind, enough to place it down as a tilt Republican state. So this is the closest I think I can get in terms of rating each state ahead of November's election. Donald Trump is favored to win the presidency with 291 electoral votes over Joe Biden's 226. Michigan and Nevada are toss-ups worth a combined 21 electoral votes. Anyways, that does it for this 2024 presidential election map prediction and analysis. Let me know whether you agree or disagree with these ratings in the comments below. Shout out to my channel members on screen here. Thank you so much for your support. If you would like to become a member, go ahead and click the join button below this video to receive exclusive perks. Finally, again, please make sure to subscribe to my channel down below and leave a like if you enjoyed it. Check out more content from my channel here, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. EP out.